Alright, welcome back to PacWest Bigfoot. This is David, and if I sound a little deep and a little weird, I had that really bad cold that's been going around, I believe, kind of right there after the holiday season or right before the holiday season. And oh my gosh, I've been pretty much laying around the house doing nothing for about the last 4 or 5 days. Today I'm about, I'd say about 85%. So I decided I'm going to go ahead and do this and get this out here for you, this next PacWest Bigfoot encounter story. And I want to say real quick also on the last video right before Christmas, it's Bigfoot Walks. Bigfoot Walks. Not Where Bigfoot Walks, that's an awesome book. It is Bigfoot Walks. That's the YouTube channel if you guys want to check it out. And all of that. With that, I hope you guys had a great Christmas. Hope you had a great New Year's Eve. And I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful, and happy New Year heading forward. So let's get into this week so that way I can go back to laying down for a little while. So with that, I'm gonna get a sip of this whole Sasquatch coffee. And I had to get out of there. Bigfoot follows boy outside of Cave Junction, Oregon. Life sucked growing up. To be honest, my parents were less like parents and more like children themselves. And because of this fact, it put me in harm's way one day of a Bigfoot outside of Cave Junction, Oregon, where we lived for a couple years. Since then, just so you know, Dave, I was adopted by some great folks and harbor no ill will towards my biological parents. They were just part of a culture that abandoned all but selfishness, and that led to self-destruction. I pray for them continually, even today. But let me tell you what I saw, what I experienced, and why I know that Bigfoot is real as you and me. Cave Junction, home for the hippie. Like you, Dave, I too came from the background that was not all roses and picket fences. As a matter of fact, it was downright horrible. Frightening at times, and that whole hippie culture leads to lives destroyed, if you ask me. I know that will supposedly offend someone with that comment, but it is my belief that the whole culture led to drug use and alcoholism in my parents. And that led to a crappy childhood that at one point I tried to run away from. And that leads me to what I experienced. We moved to Cave Junction, Oregon, from Southern California in 1974 to be exact. My parents had been a part of the free love hippie culture by that point since it almost started. And with it came this selfish need to do just that. Think about self first and everything else second, if at all. I guess I was the if at all part, like many kids back then. For them, that lifestyle led to drinking and drugs, which for the most part was marijuana, but it eventually turned into harder drugs over time. By the time we moved to CJ, my parents had a farm of plants going on in the sheds, and they were becoming more and more belligerent with each other and me. They became drug addicts and alcoholics by that point. It was getting really bad, and I was almost 13 years old at the time. I was at my wit's end and ready to run away. That is when I would come across something I never imagined was real, and put myself in a situation I thought was going to end with me dead, one way or the other. I'm out of here. I will not get into it any further here, my history with my biological parents, that is, except for that day. The one that put me in such harm's way that I was taken from them and placed into foster care and for good. There were already some incidents with the local authorities and my parents, and for me, for that matter, up to that point. But that day, everything kind of spun out of control, and my mom and dad ended up in almost a fist fight between themselves. And at one point, I got hit. I hate to say it, but that moment is what led me to finally tell myself, I have to get out of here. So, the plan was to wait until after the cops left, who had shown up because of the neighbors once again calling them about the screaming and yelling yet again. This time, however, they cuffed my dad for a bit and stuck him in the back of the car. But eventually, they would leave both of them with one last and very stiff warning. I have to say this. Those officers were really, really, really nice. But as for me, I'd be leaving within the hour. It was snowing. It was cold. I would need to dress warmly and take with me only what would keep me warm. I grabbed my large backpack and stuffed it in a small tarp, clothing, matches, and small hatchet, and my buck knife to go with it. I also grabbed some food, but just a few cans that I could and a box of crackers. All I needed to do was get to the I-5 freeway and from there hitch my way to Southern California, where I had old friends and some family I knew who would take me in and even hide me for as long as I needed. I finally got my chance to run away when they both seemed to have passed out or just took a nap after that long, drawn-out tirade earlier in the day. It was cold. Really, really cold. I looked at the thermometer out on the outside of the house, and it read 31 degrees, and it was 3 p.m. at the time. And just so you know, I had never heard anything, seen anything, or even experienced anything before that could have been considered a Bigfoot before that afternoon and night, ever. Through the woods. We lived pretty far off the main highway. Walking down the side of the old country road out of there was no-go. Nothing would get me tracked down faster than being obvious. So I followed a small game trail that was near a larger trail many local dirt bikers ran up and down on. This would lead me southeast of town, through the thick of the forest here, but I knew where I was going and I could navigate well with my little map and the compass on the end of my buck knife. There were some things my parents taught me, and being out in nature was one of them. At least up to that point they did. It was getting dark pretty fast, and the snow was starting to pick up about an hour later. About an hour after that, and miles along, is when I noticed something or someone following me. Have you ever had that feeling while out in the woods, alone or not, that you were literally being watched? Yeah, I was having a goosebump moment all of a sudden. I finally stopped and started looking around me when all of a sudden I thought I saw something duck and disappear quickly behind a tree. I could not be sure it was a person or not, but it was something. And it was large enough to stand out quickly in all the white that surrounded me. I was a bit freaked out, so I kept moving a bit faster, picking up the pace to get out of the area just in case it was some weirdo or animal that may have found itself or themselves interested in a little old me. I had been moving so fast I must have covered another mile or two pretty quickly. I found myself on the side of an old logging road that looked to be used by only four-wheelers and dirt bikers by then. I decided to stop here for the night and not lay any tracks over the road till morning. It was starting to get dark anyway. Once again, I sat up. As I set up my tarp for the night, long night, and get myself some firewood, I had that crazy feeling again. I was being watched. I looked around, but this time nothing moved with the branches of the trees and the light, cold breeze. I finally started a fire just before dark, and it did make me feel safer and warmer. I knew I would not be spotted as the glow was low and in the snow made for horrible visibility, even at night. But that was only if you were human. If you're Bigfoot, well, maybe your eyesight and other senses are better. He's got legs. It was well past midnight when I noticed I was getting too cold for my own good. The fire was almost out, and I swear I was in the beginning stage of hypothermia. So immediately I got up, stoked the fire back up, and started moving around a bit until I was feeling better, which did not take long. I huddled back down against the tree I was leaning against when I noticed something odd again just inside the flickering light of the fire. It looked like legs. At first, and for a split second, I suppose I figured they were just a tree trunk, but no, I was seeing legs, large and hairy ones. This was made plain as day seconds later when they would literally move, and whatever it was walked behind a very large Douglas fir, I think it was. I was pooping my pants that moment, to be honest. These were not legs of a bear, mountain lion, or human for that matter. I could clearly see that. The only thing that came to my mind was of the creature animal I'd first heard about here in CJ from the kids at school. Bigfoot. Some of the kids, well, I had befriended, had mentioned this thing at one time or another. But like much of anything else in the world of Loch Ness and aliens from another universe, I thought it was all made up. But those legs were covered in hair and massive. Not to mention, I swear I could see fingers just past the knees for a split second. I did not see this thing move any more than that. It walked behind the tree, and it seemed to have just stood there. I could not go back to sleep at that moment, and so I stoked up the fire and sat my buck knife next to me. After a few minutes, I thought I heard it move off, whatever it was. Eventually, it got colder, and I did get sleepy. And without any more visuals or sounds, I fell asleep not an hour later. That was a big mistake. Taunted by a monster. I woke suddenly because I felt something literally run past me, as in the ground trembling beneath me, and the sound gave away the fact whatever it was must weigh a ton or near it, literally. And it was. Again, I watched a pair of legs run from one tree to one closer to me, and the remaining embers, by the remaining embers of my little fire. Screaming, the smacking of trees and the ground with its hands, and a sudden rush at me. That had me rolling away from my spot by the tree and fire and running for my life. That is what happened seconds later. I was standing in the middle of the road. It was about 20 to 25 yards or so on the other side of where I was camped. It was still mostly dark, but morning was coming on when I saw the ugliest monster I'd ever seen in my lifetime. It was truly scary looking. It was now standing and swaying there in front of me, and in front of a tree where my stuff was, backpack and all, and that included my only weapon, my knife. Not that it would do anything to this thing if I had to protect myself from an attack, that's for sure. It was tall, at least a good 3 or 4 heads taller than my dad, and he was just over 6 foot. I could see it was covered in hair, a cinnamon color, by the way. It was slightly bent at the waist, and its left arm that was stretched out against the tree was muscular, you could tell, and its hand was so big it seemed to cover the face of that massive trunk of the tree. It stood there with its ugly and droopy-looking face just staring at me with what seemed to be a snarl of sorts on its face. It suddenly made some weird but short noises at me and started beating the ground real hard with its hands again. I got scared and started running, and so did that Bigfoot. It stayed just off the road and out of the open, I noticed. So I kept running for what seemed 3 to 4 minutes. I did not know exactly which way was back to the highway and home. I just kept running and made my best guess in my sudden confusion at that point. Cold, harassed, and dying slowly. I kept to the old abandoned road, hoping that someone would come up it at some point. Not that it was a road that was frequently used except by off-roaders. I was cold, really, really cold, and I swear I was slowing down in my pace because of it. That creature, that Bigfoot, kept up its pace just fine, and was starting to toss rocks and pine cones and even ripping limbs off of trees and throwing them at me as well. From time to time, it would let out fast but ear-piercing and a screech of sorts and jump back into the woods just far enough that I could not see it. But believe you me, I could hear it, and it made me even more confused and frightened. As I was getting colder and colder, eventually, against my own better senses that were fading as well, I sat down. After a few minutes, I don't know what it was, probably the small rocks that hit me and hurt. But I sat back up and looked down the old road. I saw some reflecting light. It had stopped snowing, and the clouds had a few breaks in them, just enough to see the light glint off of something. I stood up and started walking, well, dragging my cold body forward down the road. And yes, the Bigfoot was still keeping up with me, and a couple of those bigger rocks hit their target, and it hurt something awful. A couple of screams from that thing later, I found myself staring at a house, an old house. It was in some disrepair at best. I tried to yell, but I was dying, I felt. Seriously, I was that cold. And it just so happened that the snow was coming back and it was getting dark again. I fell over at that same time. I heard that Bigfoot run past me yelling at the whole time. And all of that was followed by a human voice, I remember, and a shot from a gun. Old Arnie. I saw him approach, barely. An old man, and I do not mean that in some derogatory way. He really was an old-timer, and his wife was standing at the door when he carried me through the door. By that point, I'd passed out. Just so you know, my parents never even knew I was gone until the next morning when I was running for my life from a monster and freezing in the cold. Eventually, however, the police were out and looking for me. Old Arnie, or Arnold and Alice, his wife, had brought me in and put me down on a mattress by the fire. I slept for about 3 hours, not long enough, but I was warm and fortunate, no frostbite. Arnie had taken off on a pretty long walk to the highway and into town to get the police. Both lived in a very off-grid way. No phone, no car, no television or electricity for that matter. It was over some cocoa that Alice made when she would tell me of my close call with Old Red. Old Red, I'd come to learn, was the Bigfoot that was chasing me, taunting me, and what I thought was going to eat me at some point. But I was assured it was not going to eat me. However, it was not happy with me being around its family, and it might have killed me if I would have been out there any longer for that reason alone. There was a family of Bigfoot, she said, that lived in the area. Old Red was the grandfather of the local clan. Alice said her and Arnie would occasionally see them, and more often than that they could hear them in the night down the road and up into the hills beyond. They had been there, she said, longer than they had been there, and they were old-timers, like I said. Either way, she did say I was in mortal danger. Old Red looked as though he was going to run me down finally. But the screaming had been heard by Arnie, and looking up, he saw me and the creature. He let off a shot, and the rest was history. Down the road. It's been over 40 years since that day and night, and I'm still anxious when out in the woods, to be honest, even if I'm driving through them to go to Bend, Oregon, to see my family during the holidays. But I do venture out here and there camping with the family. But I am always armed, and always where lots of people are. Arnie showed up, just so you know, and apparently my dad was hauled off to jail for a few days for hitting my mom that day. As for me, I was eventually taken away from my parents that day as well. And a year later, after a couple of great foster homes that really were good experiences, I ended up being adopted. Today I work and run my own accounting business, something I learned from my mom and dad, my adopted parents. I never saw Arnie or Alice after that day, however. I did go back recently to the old house about a year ago. The house is gone, and it is as if the forest just swallowed it up completely, erasing any proof it was there, or them for that matter. I did not hang out long, but I swear I felt like I was being watched again after just a few minutes of being out there. But that was probably just the memories coming back of the night and day I saw Bigfoot. With that, that's my encounter story. Thanks. Harley.